That's wrong, cried Wolf. Have you forgot to tell me what big teeth I've got? Ah, well, no matter what you say, I'm going to eat you anyway. The small girl smiles. One eyelid flickers. She whips a pistol from her knickers. She aims it at the creature's head, and bang, 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 she shoots him dead. A few weeks later in the wood I came across Miss Riding Hood, but what a change, no cloak of red, no silly hood upon her head. She said, hello, and do please note my lovely furry wolfskin coat. Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. I'm Ian. Today we are talking about Jodi McDavid and Ian Brodie's children's television. You might recognize one of the names of the co-authors. So as we talk about folktale, one of the really interesting questions is, in the 21st century, where do we learn them? We still we being folklorists, I guess, romanticize to a certain extent that they are part of the oral tradition, in as much as we do hear them spoken out loud. Perhaps we think that they are told to us as bedtime stories. Perhaps we think they're told to us by, that sort of professional cast of storytellers who will come and visit schools. Sometimes, of course, it's decried that they're learned from reading from the books and that the dynamic tradition isn't necessarily in place anymore. But somehow we do know them. Not all of them, clearly. I'm sure if you are reading collections of folk tales from Grimm, from Perrault, from anywhere, that you're going to come across ones that you haven't necessarily hit before. As I studied folktale, I realized that I didn't have a particularly rich childhood canon of tales, and I would come across ones that like Bluebeard or the the magic porridge pot, those sorts of tales. And it's like, I never came across these. My family wasn't that big on love. But I knew, I know the basics. I knew the standards. I knew beyond the simple Disney canon, I knew some. But the idea, at least the premise that we've been operating with, is that by the time someone hits a certain age, they have been exposed not simply to a version, but often multiple versions. Multiple versions of a type, so much so that you begin to recognize, even if you're not speaking in these words, you begin to recognize the type. You begin to recognize that here is something that achieves multiple iterations. And McDavid and I were interested in children's television in particular, and this is from an anthology on the mediation of tale that Pauline Greenhill and her colleagues put together, and we were asked to write about children's television, in part because we had previously contributed to a volume on the use of Super Y. Super Y is a PBS television series where kids, cartoon kids, fly into stories and use the stories are almost exclusively, with some fairly broad exceptions, either traditional narratives or Kunstmärchen, things like stories from the 19th century that are written in the style of folktale but were never part of the folk canon. So Hans Christian Andersen and Pinocchio and a whole bunch of 19th century children's literature that's entered into the cultural repertoire. But they would go into the stories, and then they would interact with characters, and it was a show to help literacy. It has had a primary objective of teaching literacy skills to children sort of like age 2 to 6. And anyway, so we were interested in how they had adapted tales, and when the opportunity came to write about children's television more broadly, we were interested in how various different shows would incorporate one tale. So if the Super Y chapter was about one show and its use of multiple types. This is about one type and its applicability in multiple shows. And it's built on that idea that one of the reasons, and we can point to some mercenary reasons why traditional story is used in children's television. The most obvious being that it is part of the public domain. They are not anyone's particular story, so you don't have to do rights clearances and so on. So all of a sudden you have, I need to write a story, and I can just retell this thing that's in common parlance. So you can begin with that as a premise that probably is operative some of the time, but I don't think it's necessarily useful to be cynical about it. They're only doing it so that they can recycle plots for cheapness sake. What they are doing is they are revisiting these stories, in part because there is going to be this familiarity. It's the same reason why we retell fairy tales in all manifestations. And when we talk about fairy tale in television and fairy tale in film, why we keep on going back to those plots. Again, it's the same reason why we keep on retelling them in traditional oral face-to-face culture. There is a continuity. There is a set of expectations that's being met. And upon this received framework, new creativity can be built. And you can look elsewhere for sort of pure novelty, pure idiosyncratic creations. And those are just as good, but there's not a hierarchical difference between taking something and reworking it and creating something entirely new. So children's television is doing the same thing, that they can sort of anticipate that what they are exposing the child to is yet another version, but not always, which is kind of one of the points that's being made in this article, that we have this strange moment where in some iterations you can tell that they don't know how much their audience knows this story, because they are dealing with children. They are dealing with children who are just on the precipice of being introduced into the canon of their culture, of the received narratives and stories that fundamentally constitute a cultural inventory or a cultural repertoire that can be revisited. But when you're very young, you haven't heard this. You have to sort of imagine this particular moment cast in time where for the very first time a person is hearing a version of this type, and they have never heard any other version. This is a wholly new story to them. There's a good example in the, which one is it? Sorry, I just need refreshment on the name of the show. Grimm Masterpiece Theater, which was an interesting program in the history of anime to begin with. It was created in Japan for a Japanese audience, using the Grimm's tales and little half-hour retellings of the Grimm narratives. And very faithful, as Bill Ellis says, almost sort of like frighteningly faithful to the editions of Grimm. And but part of that frightening faithfulness is the notion that, for at least for their Japanese audience in the early 1980s, these aren't part of their cultural repertoire. These are tales from overseas. These are completely foreign stories. So there's a remarkable, that faithful retelling of them is in part because they can't anticipate anything on behalf of their audience member. Now then, what makes this sort of an epochal moment in the history of anime is that they become dubbed into English and are broadcast in North America. And for many, that's the first, many North Americans, that's their first encounter with Japanese animation. And the show is actually quite lovely. There's some interesting, just as a side note, there's some interesting variations between the Japanese and the English versions over and above language. One is that the Japanese versions, if you've ever seen anime, they'll often just have beautiful pastoral scenes. And so you can watch them on various forms on YouTube. And in the Japanese version, as she's walking through the forest, or walking, through the fields of flowers, it's just her walking through fields of flowers and a little bit of music and flowers waving in the breeze. And presumably the North American dubbers thought that, oh, these children cannot handle silence. And so it's just filled with monologue or narration. We can't have a moment of just contemplate this. So it's an interesting dynamic in terms of audiences, and also the anticipation that this would be for children, whereas the Grimm's version, the Japanese version, would be family oriented, but not necessarily the exclusive domain of children. The second thing is that even though there's not particular gruesome violence, there are moments where, like when the wolf is, spoilers, the wolf attacks the grandmother. There are moments when the wolf is approaching the grandmother where, she's like recoiling in terror, and it is not frightening, not particularly frightening, but there is threat. And in the North American version, they cut it early, and so he looms. Looms is as much as it gets, but no sort of teeth and no spilling of blood and cool things like that. Anyway, I digress. So they're speaking to an entire, they're speaking with the idea that the story would not necessarily be known to the audience. And so it's very monologic. It's very sort of top down. It is very much the way a parent tells a story to a child. This is an authoritative version in a way you sort of don't interrupt. Because one of the things we talk about in the article is that we distinguish between, as folklorists will often distinguish sort of two kinds of children's folklore. There is the folklore that is told to children, which is very much in keeping with that. It has functions and uses, and it is about inculcating in the youth, and there's the identity pairing of parent and child implies a certain amount of unidirectionality, that this is being told beginning, middle, end. And then there's the culture, there's the folk culture that children share amongst themselves, which is obviously not as hierarchical, and it is often behind the scenes of parental authority, so it's a testing of boundaries, and it's playful, and it's taking texts and it's sort of disentangling them. And so the Grimm's Masterpiece Theater is the sort of top-down, I'm going to tell you a story from beginning, middle, end, entirely, in its entirety. It's a monologue. It's a textual version. Similarly, HBO's Happily Ever After. That was an interesting experiment because what they wanted to do was internationalize folktale, but what they really did is they took the Grimm's versions and recast them into different cultures. So on one hand, it's a noble argument in terms of the feeling of being represented on screen. On the other hand, there are world folktales, including things like African American, African, Chinese versions of these tales that they could have actually employed. So instead, they had a fairly conservative, again, monologic telling of these tales, beginning, middle, end, all the way through, that was really sort of winking at, instead of the kind of Middle European we are using for their version of Little Red Riding Hood, we're using Chinese. So instead of going to a field of flowers, to the wolf encouraging her to go to a field of flowers, she's encouraged to go to a tea house. When he's referring to her, talking in the sort of the, oh, my little dear, or when, and as disguised as the grandmother, he's referring to her as various, like, oh, my dumpling, oh, my lychee nut. And so just using standardized, not necessarily disparaging, but stereotypical references to Chinese culture that a North American audience would easily get. So, but they're both HBO's, what's it called, Happily Ever After, and the Grimm's Masterpiece Theater. They're both anthologies, beginning, middle, end, top-down stories. Then they're the ones where there are other anthology programs that are much more parodic. And the anthology is that there's not necessarily meant to be continuity from episode to episode. which I'll contrast in a minute. But basically, there's a conceit that these stories exist as separable entities from the overarching flow of the series, and you can certainly sort of pluck one down off a shelf and consume it as it stands. But there are parodic ones. Spike Milligan, the British humorist who was in The Goons, he was at least the voice, and I believe he was actually the author as well of Wolves, Witches, and Giants, which were subversive little versions of the stories where no need to sort of be conservative or appropriate. You can tell that there was a playfulness that was happening with the tale. And where, like the grandmother's home and she's watching Australian soap operas, and motor cars enter into the background quite easily. So the idea is that at the very least, unlike Happily Ever After, unlike Grimm's Masterpiece Theater, unlike those two, the idea is that the child probably knows the story and is now seeing something done with a story that they are familiar with. This is not a clean version. This is an inherently sort of twisted version because you're seeing something different. The other another anthology example is in the Fractured Fairy Tales, which was a segment that came with the Rocky and Bullwinkle show, which went under a number of different names, but Flying Moose and Squirrel. And the Fractured Fairy Tales would retell fairy tales in a, again, sort of subverted sort of way. And one of the things that would happen is that the narrator would say, we all know the story of. And so just coming right out and saying that there are these, that this is something that you know already, and now I am retelling it in a different way. So speaking to and making plain that we know that we are talking about a story that you know and I know, now I am revisiting it, which reframes it as opposed to that top-down version. The one that they do is clear, not simply a twisted retelling like Spike Milligan's version, but actually a sort of a wholly new text where the has to do with the Riding Hood's Anonymous, where the wolf has decided to has sworn off, like Alcoholics Anonymous, has sworn off the eating of little girls in Red Riding Hoods. But she doesn't believe him, and so she keeps on subjecting him to violence. He's like, no, I'm very good. But then he realizes that that doesn't mean that he can't eat grandmothers, and so he does so. There you have parody. You have a thing that it has. I mean, they're narratives. They have a beginning, a middle, and end. They have a structural integrity. But more importantly, you know that they can sort of be pursued. You know when watching them that there is something else out there that is being referenced. So even if you don't know, even if it's the very first time you've heard a Little Red Riding Hood version, you know because it signals that this is one version of many, that there is perhaps a more sober text that is being referred to. Then you have children's fairy tale and children's stories where you have that sense of continuities. Because one of the things that we can do with a fairy tale is you can easily replace characters because they are structured, because they have to do with the youth who, a young person who has some unlikely success or unlikely encounter with people who are different from them, and there's a complication, and that complication is a rise, and so on. You can replace the main character with a different character, one that you already know. So in things like Tupi and Binu, in things like Backyardigans, in things like Max and Ruby, which we discuss in the article, you can take the Max and Ruby characters and you can slot them in. And so you now have the reference not simply or not exclusively to Little Red Riding Hood. In fact, you don't even need to build on the reference of Little Red Riding Hood. More to the point, you now have the intertext of all the other episodes of Max and Ruby. So the relationship of Ruby to Max informs your understanding of Little Red Riding Hood, even if Little Red Riding Hood is this is the first time that you've ever encountered it. So now you have this sort of multiple interplay. Nevertheless, within that world, you have the idea that this is a story that exists, and that both of the characters, both Max and Ruby, know that the story exists in this world. And so even in their play, they are retelling it and they are enacting type through a specific version. And then my last, and perhaps because I'm an old sentimentalist, my favorite example, having to do with sort of the ubiquity of type and how you can see it in children's television, is in Sesame Street. Because Sesame Street hardly ever, in fact, I think I can confidently say never, told a version of Little Red Riding Hood from beginning to middle to end. It never communicated the story in an integral unit. It only really ever communicated it in fragments, and it implied it through motif. And so, or it would have a scene, and still a parodic scene, but you don't need the entire story to be reenacted. Now, some of that is so they could do everything on one set, as opposed to have Mother's House and the woods and Grandmother's house. They could just do it all in one shot, the way Sesame Street would typically do it. But they could just, play around with the formula. So they have Little Red Riding Hood, as played by Cookie Monster, being interviewed by Kermit the Frog when he's doing Muppet News Flash. And so they're not only referencing Little Red Riding Hood, they are also parodying the rhythms of television itself. So it's this wonderful melange of postmodernism where the texts are all out there waiting to be recombined in some ways. But it builds on the idea that the child probably knows this well enough that they don't even need to reenact it tongue-in-cheek from beginning to middle and end, like Spike Milligan does, or like Max and Ruby does, which isn't tongue-in-cheek, but is sort of referencing, building on a set standard. It can just hint at. It knows it as a kernel narrative. It knows that to tell the entire story is probably superfluous, and it's demonstrating the sort of the canonicity of the story, even in its very early ages. When Sesame Street in particular, which is a good example because there's just so many hours of it, and there's so much content that was produced. When they do present traditional tales that they assume that the audience doesn't know, they don't play that postmodern game. It's like, okay, you don't know this story, and we're going to do it fairly straightforward from beginning to middle and end. So there's the epic Ibibio story, Why the Sun and Moon Live in the Sky. And when it was done on Sesame Street, it was very straightforward. It was much more monologic. So I'm telling you this story beginning, middle, and end. And when I say telling you, I don't want to imply some kind of necessarily top down, but they weren't making the assumptions. They weren't making the assumptions of that kind of cultural fluency. And it was probably for the best, because there is something to be said about this reluctance, but the hesitation that children's television has and sometimes displays about making assumptions of the children, of any one given child's fluency with the canon of folktale. And that what happens when this might be one of the few, if not the only, version that you hear? How are you representing a culture? It's one thing if we're talking about something that has achieved such a level of permeation into the culture that even if your first experience with Little Red Riding Hood is in a strange fragment in Sesame Street, you can make a sound and sensible judgment that within a short while you will grasp the story in its integrity, in its integral whole. And in fact, that's one of the things that this sort of postmodern fragmentary thing does, is that it invites you in. Because you can sort of think, I don't know this story, but I know that there is a story to be known. And so, all of a sudden, merely on the level of motif, and of course the fact that they have often named it as such, when you seek it out, you're now bringing your fragmentary knowledge of it, not simply the knowledge of some kind of integral whole, but it's this reciprocity and this cyclical nature that's in place. But what happens when we're dealing, when they go outside of this sort of pan-European, North American popular culture canon, where I know that, you know, in the next 2 years this kid is going to hear 15 different versions of Little Red Riding Hood, so I don't need to be precious. But if it's a world tale, a tale of a marginalized culture, an international culture that often doesn't get their tales performed to a North American audience, what kind of how do we approach that? How do we approach the idea of their fluency with it? How do we approach the creativity? What is our responsibility? Those questions are in place. So what I like, it's when you're teaching your own stuff by saying what I like about this article, but I think one of the things that we were trying to achieve when we wrote this is this notion of unpacking what's meant by people being familiar with these stories. Because we almost assume that, in folklore, we almost assume that that is a given. It's an axiom that these stories are somewhere in the canon, in each individual's head canon, as the kids say. But we need to look at those moments when they come in and when they are most likely to come in. They're most likely to come in through mediated culture. So how do these stories become adapted with the various levels of responsibility that are felt, not simply in terms of content and erasing all the naughtiness from quote-unquote original versions, but in terms of as I introduce someone to a canon, I being a children's television producer, what am I doing? What is my responsibility? We sum it up at one point, and I'm trying to remember the page. Is it in the final? Yes. Okay. The use of fairy tale in children's television demonstrates two interconnected moments in narrative canonicity. The provision of a core of texts, where basically we are saying, here are the stories you ought to know, you being an audience who's a child and audience who's representative of, and presumably wishes to participate in North American culture by, in one of the ways, being fluent in its sort of core texts. But also the assumption of that same core. This will make sense because of the stories you ought to know. And that dynamic in place. With adults, you ought to know these texts. You should be able to watch Once Upon a Time and get what's going on there. That's a demonstration of intertextual fluency. But what happens when it's for the kid the very first time? Stan Lee said that every comic book is someone's first comic book. Well, every version of Little Red Riding Hood is potentially someone's first version of it. Doubly so when your audience is comprised of itty-bitty widow children. That is all. This has been my discussion, Jodi McDavid and Ian Brodie's Children's Television. I bid you well, my friends.